Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's the end of 2020. Who knows what day it is? We just got to make it a couple more hours to get to 2021. So glad for all of you to join us today here live as we do the last GrimmCon of the year. This is our third one. We started it back in, I think our first one was in the beginning of April, and the entire thing is all about giving back to the community, highlighting speakers that have never had a voice before because it's so important that we're as inclusive as possible in security. If we've learned anything, no one person, except maybe Sounil, has it all figured out. The rest of us all understand a part of the problem, and so the more different perspectives we can bring to the table only makes our security stronger. And that's what track 2 is what we call the new speaker track. We pair them with volunteer coaches a month before their talk, help them with their research, help them with their presentation, help them with their presentation skills, and ultimately bringing, like I said, different voices to the table. On the charity front, it's been a hard year for a lot of folks, and it's going to be a cold winter. So we're not necessarily going to highlight a particular charity, but we would ask, please give to the local food banks. It has never been harder in America for a very long time, at least, and I can only imagine it's the same for our international friends that are joining us in their countries. We are fortunate enough to be in an industry that has pretty much taken care of us financially. So help your fellow human that could really use the help. We're going to be on Discord. So if you have not joined us there yet, please do. Almost all of the speakers will be available on Discord for Q&A and different interaction, along with a lot of other hijinks. We'll also be running a CTF brought to you by John Hammond. We're going to have prizes. I think my favorite prize on that, of course, is for those of you who have not seen the legendary GRIMM toaster, who is a long-running component of the GRIMM CTF. We're going to give away a toaster to the #1 winner, along with a lot of other prizes. Also would like to give a thank you to the ICS Village and the Red Team Village, along with all the volunteers that help make this event happen, and the folks running the Career Hacking Village to help you with resume reviews and different questions about advancing your career. I'm going to be joined on track 1 today by my good friend, Tyler Robinson.
Hello. Appreciate it, Bryson.
You're going to have to do better than that to stick with me all day.
Well, it is great to be here, and honestly, like GRIMM and all of the things that they do, especially the GrimmCon, going virtual has been kind of nice to have the same faces, the same families, and some really expert commentary and talks. So very honored to be here. We'll be here filling in the blank silent space, doing a little MC work with Bryson, although he came much more decorated than I did. Obviously forgot my unicorn horn. But yeah, definitely honored to be here, and excited to see what today has.
There can only be one unicorn, Tyler.
Very true, very true.
Yeah, appreciate your help today. And finally, our keynote of the day is another good friend of mine, Sounil Yu. Most people like to give long bios and fluffy statements. I will put simply to sign off here, Sounil is the smartest person in cyber I've ever met. You can either draw the conclusion I haven't met that many people, or I have, and he is the smartest person I know. Sounil, take it away.
Thanks, Bryson, for that introduction. Again, I don't claim his comment on that, and only look forward to living up to that sort of standard. But anyway, thanks everyone for joining my talk here. So I want to make sure this is a little bit interactive here at the beginning. So before I start, let's go through that thought exercise. Let me actually present my slides too. Okay, yes, all right. So let's go through a thought exercise. What type of weapon would you be willing to give today's generation of AI? What kind of weapon would you be willing to give to today's generation of AI? Feel free to put this into the Discord chat. What type of weapon? Scissors, a knife, a gun, a bazooka, a speeding car, nuclear launch codes, a sharp pencil. Give that a thought for a moment, and feel free to drop whatever weapon you'd be willing to give today's generation of AI into this Discord chat. Give that some thought. Now, anyone who owns a dog or works in security knows about dog years, and 2020 feels like a dog year, right? So here's my next question. If you were to put a human age to today's AI, what age would that be? Again, so if you were to put an age to today's, a human age to today's AI, what age would that be? Now, given whatever age and weapon you chose, the question for you is, do they make sense? Do they align? Okay. Now, there's a lot of talk about topics like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation within today's, within the security industry today. And we're oftentimes led to believe that these capabilities will revolutionize our security practices. However, we need to be conscious of the limits of these capabilities before we entrust them with matters of importance. And so today I'll discuss how machine learning and automation are distinct and how they fit together through decision making. Many people combine these capabilities and use them almost interchangeably, really. I mean, especially if we're letting the machine also do the automated decision making. It's easy to fall into this trap, and doing so can be quite dangerous and create many unintended consequences. So before we let machines do automated decision making, let's understand the limits of these capabilities. Let's actually understand what is the age of AI. Now, using a combination of multiple frameworks, I plan to show you how we can determine how far AI and ML has advanced and understand when it might be appropriate to connect it through automation and through automated decision making. These different frameworks will help us answer some of the following questions about what is the difference between AI, ML, and automation. How separable are these functions? How mature are these capabilities, and how mature do they need to be for certain security relevant use cases? And I'm sure anybody who's been in this for a while, there's a long history of epic fails when it comes to automated decision making. Using these frameworks, what can we learn from these failures, and what does it imply for security? And lastly, given the current level of maturity of these capabilities, what guardrails should we consider? So the first framework for consideration is something that I think many people already know, which is the OODA loop, or a slightly reworded, modified version of it, courtesy of the IACD program. Now, when we look at most security stacks, they have elements of these four components: sensing, sense-making, decision-making, and acting. Sensing requires sensors, the collection of telemetry from these sensors, and the ability to get them to a point where data is usable. Sense-making is where we have analytics, and this is where AI and machine learning goes. Next up is decision-making, and this is where we take information, and based on our knowledge, wisdom, and judgment, we hope to make the right decisions and that define the next courses of action. And then lastly, in acting, you have the actual execution of the decision. And if we use this construct, then it should become pretty clear that AI and ML is distinct from automation, and that there's a decision-making function that connects AI and ML with automation. And it's important to consider these separately, because when we conflate these together, we also risk connecting these capabilities together without a mature decision-making framework, which then may result in severe unintended consequences. So this is the first framework, to explicitly call out the function of decision-making, which separates out sense-making from acting, or AI/ML from automation. Now, there's a famous movie that most of us hopefully know, and the system that was created called Skynet. If you're not familiar with it, I'll give you a quick overview. And even if you are familiar with it, it's good to know some of the basic principles that undergirded the development of Skynet. So again, Skynet was first popularized through a movie called The Terminator. It was built as the Global Information Grid, or the Digital Defense Network. Later, it was given command over all computerized military hardware and systems, including the B-2 stealth bomber. And ultimately, the reason for doing this was to remove the possibility of human error, basically ensure that there was a fast, efficient response to enemy attack. Okay, these are words directly out of the definition of Skynet. Now, what's interesting is when we map this to the OODA loop, there's some interesting facets that come up. Sensing, that was the global information grid and the digital defense network, the sensing and sense-making aspects of this construct. The acting, well, they have the ability to act on systems through all the weaponry and all the arsenal that they have access to. Now, what about decision making? Okay, well, decision making was actually removed, at least the human decision making, because we wanted to remove human error and our slow reaction time, which is generally speaking a good thing. We want to be able to speed up our response to enemy attack. By the way, the response to enemy attack, that's a security use case. So consider the parallels here for what we do in security. We are trying to remove human decision making as a security use case to satisfy a security use case. Is this what we want to do? Or is this what we want to do given the current age of AI? All right, so give that some thought. Now, I'm going to give you another framework. And part of the idea here is I'm going to give you multiple frameworks. I'm sure if anybody who knows me knows that I love frameworks. It helps us think through these things. I'm going to share multiple frameworks, none of which, by the way, involve something that looks like a bingo card. So, all right. So the next framework is from DARPA, and it gives perspectives on what specific factors drive higher levels of capability as it pertains to artificial intelligence. Within DARPA's framework, there are also four components, and they align partially with the OODA loop. The first factor is perceiving. How well can a machine consume large quantities of data about the world and understand what's going on? That's sensing and a little bit of sense making. The second factor is learning. How well can a machine take the information and start adapting to that environment? This is squarely in sense making. The third factor is reasoning. How well can a machine decide on what to do next and explain why it made that decision? And this is squarely in decision making. Note that DARPA does call out decision making separately from the other functions, but it still bundles it all within the context of AI. And the fourth factor is abstracting. How well can a machine take what is learned and what is decided and apply it to an entirely different domain? There's no analog here with the OODA loop, but note that here too, DARPA doesn't include the action itself or the execution of the decisions as a part of AI, okay? Again, we conflate these together, the notion of AI and the automation piece, but note here that, or the action piece, but note again here that DARPA doesn't include the action itself or the execution of the decisions. Now, within DARPA's view of AI, they talk about three waves. The first wave is based on handcrafted knowledge. This has a little bit of perceiving and lots of reasoning. The examples they give include things like tax preparation, software, and chess. Know that even the Cyber Grand Challenge that we saw happen at Black Hat a couple years ago, they are that fits into this category. They actually specifically put it into this category. Capabilities in this wave rely heavily on the handcrafted knowledge of experts who can codify their decisions into software and provide deterministic outcomes. For example, in tax prep software, it can take basic inputs in various formats and make highly deterministic decisions over them. First generation SIMs perceive their world using common event and logging formats and reason over this data using various alerting rules that are handcrafted. And these capabilities fit into this first wave very well. The second wave has a lot of perceiving and learning capabilities. Machine learning and most of what people call AI today is in this space. The second wave can do some amazing things to find patterns similar to what we have seen previously. And this pattern recognition has been extraordinarily useful to develop capabilities like voice and facial recognition, somewhat self-driving cars. And the current generation of all the SIM products that we see today that have all the sprinkling of ML and AI. But the second wave of capabilities is also very limited in its reasoning capabilities. And remember, this is where decision-making lives. And note that DARPA calls this statistical learning. And on that point, let's talk about statistical learning for a moment. Stats are very helpful to spot similarity to known patterns, but stats without context or explanation can be very dangerous. And you may have heard this quote before. There are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Or this awesome book entitled How to Lie with Statistics. And did you know that 83.7% of all stats are entirely made up? Well, stats without context or proper explanation has its limitations. And likewise, systems that use statistical-based machine learning will have similar limitations. And as I've mentioned previously, stats are helpful to spot similarity to known patterns and fitting a curve, but without context or explanation, the similarities may mean nothing. For example, here are some known patterns that are similar. Turns out that people who drown after falling out of a fishing boat correlates nicely with the marriage rate in Kentucky. And our spin on science, space, and tech correlates really nicely with suicides by hanging and strangulation and suffocation. But we know that these are absurd. I mean, these are absurd, unexplainable correlations. But why do we know that? And more importantly, how would a machine know that? And when these techniques are applied to security problems, we encounter similar challenges. There's this great paper on the use of machine learning for network intrusion detection. Note that this was written in 2010, okay, 2010, well before the craze that we have seen recently around AI and ML. This paper specifically talks about why it's so fundamentally different and significantly harder to apply ML to security problems. In a nutshell, it distills down to the differences in the nature of problems and the environment that we're in when it comes to security. Machine learning works really great in closed worlds where things are bounded and the rules don't change. However, the internet and most enterprise environments are unbounded environments, and the rules change all the time. Furthermore, the attackers are constantly trying to change the rules through novel attacks. So, as I mentioned before, machine learning really isn't that great for finding truly novel, for finding those things that are truly novel, particularly in an open environments like the internet. There are many things like outliers, which is why we end up with so many false positives when it comes to machine learning. And when we tune our machine learning systems, we recognize that the costs and the consequences for a false negative are pretty high. So in other words, we don't want to misclassify a real attack as being normal. But as we try to ensure that we don't have any false positives, we typically end up with many false positives. I'm sorry, because we try to ensure that we don't have any false negatives, we typically end up with many false positives, which has its own associated costs in terms of time, analyst time. And by the way, most any vendor in this space that makes a claim about machine learning in their product will state that they have very few false positives. And this, as many know, this is just a play on words. I mean, they mean that everything that they alert on will be an anomaly, which they don't deem to be a false positive because, well, it really is an anomaly. But as we all know, the vast majority of these anomalies are benign. There are only a few that are malicious. Ultimately, we need these systems to help us find malicious anomalies that we already know the pattern for, but also these malicious anomalies that are novel, and all the while filtering out all the benign stuff. But to reduce the false positive problem, these systems need to explain why these anomalies are malicious. And so that takes us to the third wave of AI, which we haven't reached yet, okay? We have not reached the third wave of AI, at least the way that DARPA defines it. This wave is what DARPA calls contextual adaptation. Here we have similar perceiving and learning capabilities as in the second wave, but we see much better reasoning and abstracting capabilities. And what this means for the third wave is that for the third wave, we would expect to see systems that can explain its alerting and decisions, ultimately leading to a clearer understanding of causal factors, not just based on statistical correlation. Ultimately, such a system will give us a better understanding of why something is classified as malicious or why it's okay. This provides much more predictability for when a system fails or succeeds and drives ultimately towards more trust in the system. And with security, we want more trustworthy systems. And to be able to do that, again, we need to understand why things worked or didn't work. And in this particular example of our ML systems today have hundreds of inputs and no real clear explanation for how it makes sense of these inputs. And here's an example of a simple attack that was made against a visual recognition system that made a stop sign look like a speed limit sign. If you asked a machine learning system why it thought it was a speed limit sign, you would struggle to get a comprehensible answer. But at this third wave, such a system should be able to tell you simply that it can differentiate a stop sign from a speed limit sign because it has these specific parameters. The stop sign is red, it's octagonal, it's at an intersection. And it's difficult to test machine learning models thoroughly, and they're easy to deceive and confuse. And this presents challenging new security problems in and of itself. But when it comes to security use cases, I think it's doubly important that we get this right because it can undermine our ability to have security at all. Machine learning models are oftentimes, we see them as black boxes that can only be tested as a unified whole. They usually have a huge number of inputs, so it's not really possible to thoroughly test even simple models with every possible combination, which leaves open the question of how an ML model will perform in a given situation. And if you have adversarial behavior that is trying to actively fool the sensing and sense-making capabilities of our security products, which we know happens, right? Then we have all the more reason to ensure that we have a better, more mature decision-making framework. And so when it comes to the maturity of a decision-making framework, let's look at this last framework. Now we homeschool our children. I think everyone's homeschooling children nowadays. Or it seems like you're homeschooling children. So anyway, but I was doing that even before the pandemic. And in the process of learning how to teach kids, we also learned about this thing called the classical education trivium. Classical education trivium. It lays out the progression of how kids learn. First, you start at the grammar stage. This is when you soak up facts and raw information. Think of it as the roots and the trunk of a tree. It sets the foundation for everything that grows above it. Next, you go to the dialectic or logic stage. Here, it's like the branches of a tree. It connects facts together and compares the truth of opinions to determine what is logically correct and what is not. This is also when kids start explaining explaining why and how one truth connects to another truth. And the last stage is the rhetoric stage, when kids grow into wisdom and can convince and persuade others, having integrated multiple subjects and disciplines together. Now, if you remember, according to the DARPA framework, the ability to explain why and how happens in the third wave, which means we're not quite there yet, okay? The third wave is when we can explain why and how, and we're not at the third wave. Now, if you match these three stages of childhood to actual ages, you get this breakdown, where during the elementary school years, the focus is primarily on grammar with a little bit of rhetoric and a little bit of dialectic. This is also why, by the way, in case you're curious, why people call elementary schools grammar schools. In junior high, we focus more on dialectic, and then in high school, we focus on rhetoric. But note again, if we need to have machines be able to explain why and how, our current technologies aren't able to do that adequately. Then we have to, if we recognize that, then we have to recognize our machines haven't quite left elementary school yet, okay? Think about that for a moment. What kind of decisions are you comfortable in delegating to kids in that age range? And by the way, kids are very capable, right? My brother-in-law said he used to drive tractors on his farm at the age of 8, right? And I used to have a BB gun when I was 8 too. Probably a really bad idea, by the way. But the question is, what kind of decisions are you comfortable in delegating to kids at that age range? Okay. The question I asked at the very beginning, what kind of weapon are you willing to give AI today? And what age is it actually? Okay. And to tie this to the OODA framework, when we compare these components to the abilities of children versus adults, we can see why we may want to take precautions when giving decision-making and acting capabilities to machines. Let's look more specifically at the comparison. consider that the decision-making engine for children is the amygdala, okay, which is fully developed at birth. And this decision-making engine is driven by fear, emotion, impulse, aggression, instinct, okay? But for a fully grown adult, that decision-making engine is the prefrontal cortex. And this is fully developed at age 25. And by the way, if you've ever wondered why you can't rent a car until age 25, that's why. It's towards the forehead and it controls behavior, meaning that you can avoid, for those who know the reference, it means that you can avoid having a tattoo on your forehead that says poor impulse control. It can prioritize inputs and essentially provides impulse control. Now, an amygdala for a decision-making engine might be fine if one's sensing and sense-making capabilities are clean and unpolluted, but let's look at that as well. For children, we have questionable inputs like their peers, memes, and social media. For adults, we might have similar inputs, but we've developed filters and better discernment for those inputs. And then for algorithms, anyone who has a teenager probably can agree with me that their sense-making may not make much sense. But for adults, we expect them to be rational and logical and to be able to explain their logic. So consider now, with the current level of maturity in our machine learning systems and the type of hostile sensory inputs that we get from the internet with unexplainable logic, what kind of decisions should we allow machines to make? To put it another way, if you were to combine machine learning and AI with robotic process automation, is the system going to mimic the behaviors of fully grown adults or teenagers? Okay, is the system going to mimic the behaviors of fully grown adults or teenagers? Do we understand the behavior of these entities, and do we have the confidence that they will behave or make decisions in an appropriate manner? And where do we get that confidence from? To understand how we can gain that confidence, now let's look at some lessons learned. And from these lessons, determine how we can gain confidence and trust in our systems, even if some of the elements that make up the system aren't fully mature. And as a way to represent what happens when we lack maturity of a certain capability, I will depict the lessons learned as skipping steps in the sense-making, decision-making, and acting process. Because when we skip steps, we need more guardrails. And we need to look at each of these scenarios with lessons. We need to look at each of these lessons learned from the security world and the guardrails that we might need for each one. So in the first scenario, we're going to go straight from sensing to acting, okay? This is like a reflex reaction. So basically, it's like a stimulus response system. There's anybody who's been in threat intel for a while know the pains of having consuming threat intel without any sense-making or decision-making, and subsequently shooting yourself in the foot by blocking all of the internet or Facebook or Google.com. In the context of automated patching, we've had situations like NotPetya and some green energy company recently as well. Even the Windows update 1809 deleted a whole bunch of files. Now, by the way, I think automated patching is absolutely a great thing. Okay, I don't want people to think that that automated patching is not a bad thing. I mean, even with the green energy company recently, we saw that 18,000 customers were potentially affected. But my question was, what happened to the other 19,000 that never patched? I mean, that's a bad sign in and of itself, right? So again, we want to encourage automated patching. We want to encourage automated blocking from threat intel, but we should make sure that we have guardrails in place. And so some of these guardrails include making sure that your sources are trustworthy and reliable, making sure that whatever actions you're defining are very narrowly scoped, to make sure that you have a kill switch ready if something goes beyond the scope of whatever has been defined. And ultimately, you want to make sure that the action itself is immediately reversible. Let's now add in sense making. We're still missing decision making. And in this context, we're starting to add more enrichment in the sense-making side of the standpoint. For threat intel, we start asking the questions like, okay, have I seen any false? Let's do a regression test, make sure that no false positives appear, and let's look at verdicts from VirusTotal or other sources to determine whether or not what other people have said about a particular, let's say, a particular artifact. But you have to also ask the question, well, are these sources reliable? You'll have 70, 80 some sources, and some are less reliable than others, right? And so just because you have 3 out of 80 hits, yeah, I think you have to really judge and assess whether or not those 3 or 4 hits that you see in VirusTotal are actually reliable in that regard. And then when it comes to automated patching, you want to make sure that the systems operate as expected after the patch. You really should be baselining these systems to say this is the expected behavior, and if it starts talking to some other node, then that would be a major red flag, right? Or that certain applications stop working, or the new application started spinning up. And when it comes to skipping decision making, here's an example of the ARPA program where we can map out 3 of the 4 elements of the OODA loop. As you can see, it's actually missing. Again, there's different aspects to the paragraph you see here. So tools to develop and characterize novel attack, that's sense making. Collect the right contextual data, that's sensing. And then it goes straight to acting, which is disseminate protective measures both within and across enterprises. It's missing a decision-making action. The decision-making step. The absence of a clear decision-making step should serve as a warning sign when you read through this statement here. And this program intends to do sensing and sense-making, and then because it's jumping right to protective measures, again, it should be a warning flag. As the chief scientist at BAE states, he says, we need to leave behind a trail of logic so that the decisions are implicitly or explicitly made clear so that we can follow up on it and ensure that the decisions are actually correct. So let's keep moving forward. There's some interesting stories here as well, but I'm running out of time. There was a situation where some of our assumptions have to also be validated. And the process itself has to be well documented and understood. One of the things that we oftentimes want to establish as guardrails is to have activities that are really highly deterministic. There's one particular story that I recall was a situation where there was a check processing, or there was a funds transfer system that used emails as a way to approve, or at least to make a specific fund transfer request. And these emails were basically, someone said, basically what happened was someone would receive this email and basically read the email, which usually came in a very similar format, take that information and basically put it into some system that would then do some sort of funds transfer. There was an assumption that the emails were coming only from legitimate sources, and that the copying action was a purely mechanical one that could have been turned into some sort of automation. Unfortunately, I'm sure you can figure out the rest of the story for what might have happened here, but they didn't have sufficient guardrails to make sure that one, the emails were coming from legitimate sources, and that someone actually gave thought into what type of transfer was occurring. And so when we skip decision making, when we choose to skip decision making, we still need to make sure that certain guardrails are in place. And some of the guardrails that you see here are examples that would have made this particular event a non-event. And then lastly, when we put in decision making, we still need to have some certain guardrails. And 2 examples here. Bank of Valletta, they shut down all their operations after some hackers broke into the system. Shutting down all your operations is a pretty significant decision-making step. Another one is with Code Red when DoD shut down NIPRNet, and who would have thunk that that would have caused us to not be able to open the locks on the Mississippi River. It was a pretty drastic step, but it was made in, I think for both these situations, it was probably made in haste without having some of these guardrails in place. One is especially having a pre-established threshold for when taking no action is worse than taking potentially a very negative action. I think in the context of the DoD example, there were authorities for actions and accountabilities for outcomes, but we organizations don't always have that. And so I think it's important that when you consider connecting, again, machine learning and automation, that you have these thresholds and you have these authorities and accountabilities for whatever outcome comes out of it. So let's look at all those different frameworks together, compare them. And what we can see is that for the most part, things are, if I look across all these different frameworks, they are generally similar in that regard, in that there's still AI, ML today is still very much in the early stages, and cover the space that you see down here. And then when it comes to the guardrails, again, connecting them, we're going to be doing regardless, but we want to make sure that we take very deliberate steps to think about what these guardrails need to be. And so here's a summary of some of the guardrails that we went through. One is make sure that your sources are trustworthy. And one way to have trustworthy sensors is to have a lot of diversity in the sensors. Make sure that you have inputs from multiple sources and you can compare and contrast them. I think VirusTotal is a great example of this because you have many sensors, some of which individually may not be that trustworthy, but collectively provides a trustworthy source. Algorithmic integrity. We need to make sure that whatever process we're expecting to have happen is well documented and understood. We have situations where oftentimes we have automation kick in and people have no idea what kind of automation is actually happening. There was an article way back around automation should be more like Iron Man and less like Ultron, right? Iron Man is fully in control of what's going on and he understands how to operate it. Ultron, you're rolling the dice in many ways. Next guardrail is to have bounded conditions. Make sure that any decisions are highly deterministic and narrowly scoped, and use extensive regression testing to make sure that it stays within that scope. We want reversibility. So if something happens, you want to be able to stick it immediately in reverse gear and be able to revert a change. Having a kill switch is going to be pretty important as we move forward in this new world. Then, as I mentioned towards the end, make sure that you have these established thresholds when you can actually put that throw that kill switch, and also have accountabilities for those actions that people take, for the actions that the machine takes, to have people who are accountable for them. Ultimately, my point in this whole discussion is we will naturally connect these things together. We do this in our heads all the time, where we take something that a machine does and then have it want it to act immediately. The point here is to have a conscious mental chasm that we create here that says, before I connect a machine-driven sense-making apparatus to a machine-driven acting apparatus, let's make sure that we know that we're deliberately doing that. And when we do that, we walk through these guardrails and ensure that we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot. And with that, I'll leave you with this modest proposal. I think we're on this inevitable march towards building Skynet, but let's just wait till it turns 25 before we give it weapons that might kill us. And with that, thanks very much.
All right, well, that was a hell of a way to close out the year, man. The good news is we are years away from that, so this is going to be what, like a 2040 problem.
Well, what in terms, if you're talking about Skynet, like the Terminator version of it, then who knows, right? It could be never. It could be 40 years. It could be, yeah. Well, it may be a while. But I'm pretty certain that we're going to start giving, and I'll give you a link on the down here. I'm pretty sure that we're starting to give weapons to essentially teenagers and 13-year-olds.
That's not scary.
No, that's a really interesting way to tie it from what has been. I saw a post earlier that was talking about how the problem with the Turing test is that it has become like a standard to achieve. And so we end up with AI that's really good at faking conversation versus the original intent of what it was meant to be. And so tying it to emotional maturity, I think, is a much more interesting way to kind of frame the problem.
Yeah,
like,
I haven't had a chance to check out Discord, but because it's over on this computer over here. But I'm curious as to what people would have said at the very beginning again. What age would you peg it at, and what sort of weapons would you be willing to give it? And when you put it towards that emotional benchmark, it helps us really recalibrate our expectations of what we should have towards these algorithms that we're using.
it's definitely a 1-year-old throwing a fit right now. And I think Atlas said it's pooping its pants most of the time. So
I would certainly give it. I would definitely say it's not what we expect it to be, but I would give it more credit than being a 1-year-old. I would still say it's like maybe around 10 years old. So.
10? I would have said between the ages of 3 and 4. I think it's a toddler that started to learn how to say no and applies it to all the situations.
Well, as anyone who has kids know, they grow up very fast, and before you know it, they become adults, and you want to make sure that you train them well, right? So anyway.
You do realize the threat in this metaphor is less what's going to happen in 25 years, but when this thing becomes a teenager.
Well, again, we let teenagers drive at age 16, right? And we let them have. Anyway, we let people have a lot of capabilities before they have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. Hence, what I'm proposing.
Well, there is a robust conversation that has been going on throughout your talk on Discord. All sorts of different commentary from answering your questions to take the conversation, and of course, and delightful tangents. So we look forward to seeing what you bring up there. Thank you for helping us.
Well.
Yeah, thank you for joining us this morning, Sounil.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you.